Oh, Becky?
Quarles. Uh, yes, did you not hear
That
me?
froze for a second.
Hi.
Me. Yeah.
Oh, oh no. So good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Good morning if you're on the West Coast, or if you're somewhere around the world. Happy day to you. My name is Becky Robinson, and I'm here today with Jack Quarles to celebrate the launch of his latest book, Expensive Sentences. I don't know about you all, but I love the title of Jack's new book, and I'm so thrilled to learn from him today. I want to let you know as we begin that we're experimenting today with a slightly different webinar format. Jack asked me if I'd ever done a 30-minute webinar, and he wanted to be super respectful of everyone's time. And so we are going to pack today's presentation into 30 minutes. Now, if you've participated in one of my events before, you know that we often have Q&A. And so what we plan to do today is to save that Q&A until after the 30 minutes is up. So if you're a diehard fan and you have plenty of time today and you want to stick around, Jack and I will also stick around for your questions after the formal presentation concludes. A few other things that we would like to cover as we get started today. The first is your question panel. Jack has put together a very interactive presentation that I'm sure we'll all enjoy. And so why don't you take a quick moment and try out that question panel. And if by chance you are with a group today, maybe listening from wherever you are at work, I'd love to have you put that in the question panel so I can give a shout out to your organization. Or if you're in an interesting place, go ahead and let us know where you're calling in from, and you can do that in the question panel. In case you're curious, I'm calling in today from my home office in Lambertville, Michigan, and Jack Quarles is only a few miles away as the crow flies in Monclova, Ohio, which they don't sound like they're close by, but they are. So it's been really fun for me to get to work with Jack in person. So hello to people in Virginia and a group from First Liberty Bank in Oklahoma. We have someone
Great.
from Santa Clara University, Dallas, Texas, sunny Minnesota. We've got some people working from home on a snow day in Michigan, Wells Fargo. We have someone from there. We have someone in Maumee who's saying hi to Jack and to me. We have someone from Montreal, wow, California, Cleveland, Ohio, Arizona. We have a couple of questions also about sound. So if you're having trouble with sound, then you're not going to hear me and you're not going to be able to tell me. But wow, we're so thrilled that all of you are investing this time with us today. We want to invite you to live tweet this webinar if you would so choose. We are using the hashtag expensive sentences. We also will have a recording of today's event. We will have slides available to you. And at the very end of the event, we have some amazing special offers that go along with Jack's book launch. So please stay on to hear about those. And again, as I mentioned, we will have the after hours Q&A, and we hope that you'll participate with us for that. So thanks again to all of you who have joined us. I'm happy to introduce Jack. Jack is the author of the newly released Expensive Sentences and also two other books, How Smart Companies Save Money and Same Side Selling. Jack is a dad and a husband and a consultant and a trainer and a board member and a speaker and a friend, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you in a few of those capacities, Jack, and I look forward to learning with you today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Becky. This is great to do this and great to do it with your crowd, your technology, and your audience. I'm so grateful for everybody who's joining today, whether it's a morning or afternoon where you are. This is going to be a fast and fun 30 minutes. I hope you're able to give it full attention. It's also going to be interactive. And in fact, I want to start by asking a question. And the question is, what decisions have you made in the last 24 hours? So think about the decisions you've made in the last 24 hours. A lot of them have probably been mundane daily decisions. For example, what am I going to eat for lunch? What should I watch on TV? Maybe you planned a work meeting and had to decide where it was going to be and whom to invite. Now, let's pause and stop looking back and start looking forward. And I want you to ask, what decisions will you make in the next year? Think about that. Now, those might be some larger frame decisions. Maybe you need to think about your job, whether it's the right job or you want to change. Or maybe your kids are in a school and you think about changing that, or you want to change school. Maybe you need to deal, like some of us, with elder care and how to make decisions to care for the older loved ones in your life. Now, the point is not to stress you out with raising these topics, but just to highlight that we make a lot of decisions. In fact, making decisions is one of the key things that we do as people. You could even simplify your value, your proposition, what you do and what you bring into a few buckets. One, the things you know, your knowledge. Two, the skills you have, the things you do. And then third, the decisions you make. But I think what's happening, particularly in the marketplace, is this is changing. It's migrating because the knowledge that we have is more available than it was before. We have the internet, and all knowledge is pretty much instantly available. So that's becoming sort of less important relatively. And then the skills that we have are still important, but because of globalization, we have access to skills from people all over the world. So I'd argue that in the mix of things, decision making is becoming more important than it ever has been. And then you add to that that we as a generation have more choices before us than anybody who's ever lived at any time in the world before, in terms of what we do with our lives, where we live, what we eat, what we wear, where we go, all sorts of decisions. The point here is a pretty simple one, that making decisions is an important part of our lives. And that brings me to the first poll question. So Becky's going to open this up, and it's a simple question, just a yes, no. Have you ever had any formal instruction in decision making? So Becky will open that up, and you can enter, and then we'll share results in just a minute. But the question is, did you ever take a class? Did you ever, in an academic setting or maybe training at work, formal instruction how to make decisions? So,
and these answers are coming in pretty fast, Jack. I'm going to give
okay,
people just a few more seconds.
Yeah, let's wait 5 more seconds and give us the tally, Becky.
I absolutely will. All right, so I'm going to share those results. It looks like 69% of you have never had any formal instruction in decision making, and that is going to change today. And 31% of you have had instruction in decision making.
Well, that's great. 31% is actually a little higher than I would have guessed, so that's a good number. And of course, what we're saying is that better decision making is a worthy pursuit. That's what we're after today. And I want to first affirm the decision you made to join us on this webinar. And I see about 150 people are on right now and more joining, so that's wonderful. Good decision to be here. My promise for you is that in the next 25 minutes, you'll be better equipped to make decisions, and specifically that you'll know how to see certain traps that pop up in the decision-making process and then how to avoid them. So that's what we're after today. I'm going to start with a story, and it's a story about when I worked in procurement at a large financial services company. Now, our job is to find ways to save money, and I came across a vendor with whom we were spending $1 million a year, almost exactly. I didn't know who this vendor was, but it belonged to the human resources area, so I went and found the director of HR, and I asked her. I said, hey, who is this vendor? We spend $1 million a year with these folks. And she said, oh, well, that's our background check provider. They help us check all the people that we hire to make sure they're okay. And so that sounded good. And she said, I know what you're trying to do, and you don't need to worry about it. So I said, okay, well, tell me, what am I trying to do, and why do I not need to worry about it? And she said, well, you're trying to save money, to squeeze the price, because that's what you procurement guys do. And she said, you don't need to worry about it because these guys haven't raised our prices in 8 years. So that sounded fine, but I didn't know anything about background checks. And so I thought I should have another conversation. I went and talked to the vice president of human resources. And you can see it was casual Friday and he was wearing shorts. And I asked him about this vendor. He said, yeah, they do our background checks. We really love those guys. You know what's great about them? And I said, what? And he said, they haven't raised our prices in 8 years. Now, something about hearing the same words kind of made my spidey senses tingle, but I still didn't know much about this. We talked, and he agreed that we could go out to the marketplace and essentially go shopping. We'd see whether we were getting a good product and getting a competitive price. So my first call in that process was to the salesperson of the incumbent company, these folks that hasn't raised our prices. And now you know what happens when a salesperson gets a call from a procurement person? Well, they don't really love it. It doesn't make their day. And if you look closely at him, his countenance kind of changed. He said, hey, why are you calling us? I know what you're after, but we do great work for you guys. And you know what else? Can you hear it?
I can.
We haven't raised your prices in 8 years. So the short aftermath of that, we went out to the marketplace and found that we could get a better product for less than half of the price. And so we started saving over $500,000 every year with this change. Now, that's a great story for a procurement guy like me because I kind of rode in on the white horse and found the savings. But if you flip it around for a minute and think of the negative side, we were overpaying by millions of dollars over a period of years. And why were we doing that? Now, first I want to say this was a big company, billions of dollars. And sometimes you kind of lose track of money, but $1 million is still a lot of money. And this is a company that had had layoffs in prior years. So those dollars weren't just on a balance sheet somewhere. They actually translated to jobs. The reason that our company didn't see this opportunity, that they were paying so much more and didn't save this money, was because we believed that since we hadn't raised their prices in 8 years, that we were getting a good price. So I thought about that a bit, and I went to my boss and I said, you know, this idea that they haven't raised their prices in 8 years, that turned out to be an expensive sentence. And he sort of chuckled and he said, yeah, you're right. I think I've heard a few of those around here. And he was right, because what I found in the following weeks and months was that on virtually every project that I started working on, I would hear more of these expensive sentences. We'd hear, oh, well, let's just pick a product because we have to implement very soon. Let's go now. Don't bother looking around. And I thought, I wonder if haste makes waste here. I wonder if that could be an expensive sentence. Or someone would say, hey, we already know which vendor we're going to use. They're the best. And I thought, well, you know, maybe they are the best, but maybe we need to look around a little bit. Maybe we could get a better product or save some money. What if they're not the best? Or we'd hear, well, we're already under budget, so we don't need to negotiate, as if a budget meant a valid market price, and that meant we were getting a good deal. Now, the context here is a company buying service or products. So I want to think about that, because when a company buys things, they have resources, right, their money, and they have goals. They have things they want to achieve. But as I've thought about this more over the years, and I've thought about the impact of expensive sentences, I think this sort of applies to almost every decision that any of us make. Because whether it's at home in our personal lives or whether it's at work on a team, we're in a situation where we all have finite resources. We have only so much time and money. We have only so much attention and energy. And we're really talking about and thinking about how do we spend that? How do we use that in a way that's going to get the goals we want? And maybe the goal is an outcome or an experience. Maybe the goal is an improved relationship. But I think the framework of using what we have to get the ends we want is very useful for us as we think about not just buying decisions, but really all decisions. And when we think about decision-making process, it's usually some sort of mix. We're evaluating the costs and the resources available, and then we evaluate our options and the benefits they have. But what happened with these expensive sentences, and what may happen in some of your decisions, is that you have this plan. As you're going along, an idea pops up. And at first the idea just sort of sits there and interrupts the decision-making process. But what can often happen is that idea can grow and inflate until it really mars the decision-making process, and it even obscures the goal. It's kind of the only thing that matters. It becomes the dominant notion that drives our decisions and where we go. And that can be a problem when that idea is an expensive sentence. So let me quickly define expensive sentence. I think you get the idea and you know what it is. It's not the end of the problem, unfortunately, and it's not the beginning of the problem. An expensive sentence reveals beliefs that are faulty and that end up wasting time or money or opportunity. They lead to a cost. These sentences come in all sorts of different forms, and so I want to share a few with you because I know you've heard some of them. They can be inside knowledge, like, oh, well, their customer service is awful. We had a bad experience with them 8 years ago, so I'm never going to use them again. Or, hey, a buddy of mine has a company. He can help you out with that problem, so you don't need to look around. And that can be an expensive sentence. Sometimes they're proverbs that sound quite wise. I love these little sayings, like you get what you pay for. Well, that can be true, but it's often not true. Or you can't change horses in midstream, meaning the course that you've picked is their final course. You can't turn around or make a change. And often, of course, that's terrible advice. Or popular beliefs, like only the big customers get the best pricing. And I can tell you that a lot of small companies believe that, but it's not necessarily true. Or they're the only game in town. They're the only ones that have that technology, that product. They're the only ones that have that relationship. They've got a secret sauce, and so you got to get in with them. You got to pay whatever they're asking because they have something that other people don't have. Of course, that leads to expense. or what I call local lore. And these are sort of ideas that get set in on your team. Like, oh, the CEO doesn't care about R&D, so don't even show him that project. He doesn't want to see it. Or, yeah, they've been talking about replacing that system for years, but it's never going to happen, not in my lifetime. So as you reflect on these, the question I want to ask you is, have you heard any recently? Have you heard any expensive sentences recently? And we want to make a poll, well, not a poll out of this, but we'd like you to enter into the questions area expensive sentences that you've heard recently. Maybe it's something that you said yourself, and then you caught yourself. Maybe it's something that somebody on your team has said. It could be at work, or it could be in your family. It could be in some other avenue.
Jack, would you like me to?
Have you heard recently?
Sure. Would you like me to share some of those, Jack?
Yeah, why don't you just share 2 or 3, Becky, and then we'll keep moving.
Sure. This is how we've always done it. Don't rock the boat. It's too good a deal to pass up. If we're going to buy this, we need to do it before the end of the year. We have a long history with this company. Drink the Kool-Aid. Some interesting, expensive sentences. It's better to rent than buy.
Love it, love it. So some great ones there. A few I've heard before and a few I haven't. So I love it. I always learn some new ones whenever we have this conversation. Now, as you're reflecting on that, you may have come across a couple of challenges thinking about an expensive sentence you've heard. And one is that we say them a lot. They're all around us. And sometimes it's hard to tell whether a sentence is really expensive or whether it's good advice. Because the other challenge is there's almost always some element of truth in these sentences. So we can't really tell them by their words, but often we can tell them by the fruit that they bring, by the impact they have. And I want to think about that a little bit. Expensive sentences create urgency and isolation. They say we have to do something now. They say we've got no other choices. They reduce option. They steal choice. They limit information. And they end conversations. They have sort of a finality about them. And as I've been thinking about expensive sentences and having these conversations for years with companies, I've really distilled it down to 3 hallmarks of an expensive sentence. And those are the words stuck, special, and scarce. Now, these are things I want you to mark in your mind and keep in your memory, because if you have your radar out for stuck, special, and scarce, then you can defend against expensive sentences until they're coming. So let's go a little bit deeper on each of these. What happens when you're stuck? It means you can't make changes. You're stuck in a relationship. You can't improve. It means that your future is driven by your past. It's sort of a sentence. Special, when you suspend normal rules and process. Now special is interesting because special is a good word in a lot of contexts, but what happens when things are special? Well, you end up working around them. You adapt to problems instead of addressing them. You tolerate things that you wouldn't normally. You treat people differently. And I think a lot of us have seen how in a work situation or even in a social situation, treating somebody as special can lead to a lot of problems. What about scarce? This one's pretty simple. When things are scarce, we hold on to them, right? We hoard them. We buy too much because we need a plan for having them and plan for them to not to be enough. We pay too much when they're scarce. So stuck, special, and scarce. These are the words I really want you to remember in terms of deciphering expensive sentences, and I use those as the 3 traps of team decision making. Now the book, Expensive Sentences, is organized around these 3 areas, and for each I present 3 myths that really can lead us astray, and 3 of the ones that I've heard the most. I'm going to read through them quickly, and I think you've already mentioned a couple of these in the sentences that we heard. It's too late to turn back now. We're too swamped to deal with that now. We need it yesterday, urgency. Or the special myths, we're different, meaning we can't do that, or that doesn't apply to us, or that could never happen here. We trust them. Now, trust is a good thing, but when you trust too much, it can lead to all sorts of expense and risk. Or that's the way we've always done it, which is one that was already volunteered on the call today. The scarce sentences, we can't afford to let him go. The customer is always right. We can probably do that ourselves. I'm briefly going to share 2 expensive sentences from very different contexts because I just want to highlight the impact that they can have. And the first is historical. Now, some of you will recognize this graphic representation of Napoleon's march to Moscow. And it starts on the left with that wide green band that symbolizes the number of troops, over 420,000 soldiers, that started out on their way to Moscow in this famous march in 1812. What happened, by the time you got to the letter B there, you can see that they've already lost more than half of their troops. And I can tell you that there was not unity among the leadership at that time. Many of the generals wanted to return. But what carried the day was the idea that, hey, we've plotted our course, we've made our plans, it's too late to turn back now. So we're going to keep going forward. Why would you make a decision like that after losing hundreds of thousands of troops already? Well, it's amazing the power that these sentences can have when they reflect our beliefs that we need to keep going on a direction we've taken. So you can see on the right side of the chart, that's Moscow, and then they started returning, and the black line represents their return, all the way back to the left side, where that thin band represents only 10,000 troops that returned, about 2% of the group that left. So expensive sentences have had quite a cost in history. Now, fortunately, most of us don't have to lead soldiers into battle as part of our jobs, and that's a good thing. But I want to share another sentence from a much more kind of everyday experience. And this is a team I was part of years ago, about 30 people. There was a specific technical skill that was very hard to find. And after months of searching, we found somebody that lived that lived states away, many states away, and he had this skill. So our chief technical officer hired him, and he made an arrangement that the guy could travel part of the time and be with us and also travel back home part of the time. His name was Lewis, not his real name, but I'm using the name Lewis. And Lewis was kind of quirky, as some technical people are, but pretty soon his quirks got to be troublesome and quite offensive to other people on the team, to the point where we had leadership discussions and said, hey, Lewis doesn't really seem to fit in here to our culture. Are we sure that we can keep him around? And the chief technical officer replied, look, I know he doesn't fit in well, but he's the only guy that can do the job. He has these skills. It took me months to find, and I can't let him go because nobody else could do it. Now, the problem didn't get better. The problem got worse. And I can't tell you how many lunch discussions were dominated by people talking about Lewis's antics, how many times I went home and talked to my wife about what he had done, and just how much concerned they were. And people threatened to quit. A couple people actually did leave the company. We're not exactly sure why. And finally it got to the point where people were saying, hey, I can't work with this guy anymore. So we had another conversation with the chief technical officer. We said, hey, can we let go of Lewis? He's really causing problems. But again, he said, no, we can't afford to let him go. Then Lewis forced our hand because he did something that caused us to have to let him go if we didn't want to take on too much legal risk. And so we made that move, and the chief technical officer was sort of afraid. He said, boy, what are we going to do? In fact, we did scramble for about 6 weeks. But then what happened? Well, a couple people on the team learned how to do what Lewis was doing. So then we got by without him, but actually we were doing much better than before because we didn't have this toxic person on our team. So the expensive sentence, he's the only guy that can do the job, led to untold pain on that team. And it's the kind of pain I know that some of you have experienced. So I share these two sentences and these two stories very quickly because I think a lot of us, in one way or another, are in situations where we feel like it's too late to change. Maybe it's something personal to do with health or a relationship, or maybe it's something in our career, or even with a business strategy. And then there are others, and I know there's some on this webinar with this many people that feel like, well, they got somebody on the team that's not really a fit, but they're doing such a great job that you've got to keep them around. And I want to tell you the cost there is probably greater than you realize, and the cost to replace that person is probably less than you realize. So what can you do? How can you help a friend who might be in this situation? That's what we're going to turn to now in the remaining few minutes, talk about how to address these expensive sentences. And at the first level, I'm offering you a very simple remedy. And that is just to ask the question, hey, is that an expensive sentence? I know we have a lot of readers on the call today, but the sad reality is that most books that are bought, nobody ever cracks them open and reads them. And that's the truth. And a lot of reasons for that. But I try to design this book cover so that you get a lot of value out of it, even if you never read the book, by putting a number of expensive sentences on the cover and then just that title. And I want to prompt that question, hey, these things I hear a lot, I say a lot, could they be expensive sentences? That's the very first level. Now, let's go a little deeper and start a conversation. And I'm presenting a simple framework for having this conversation with somebody else to sort of challenge and unearth and then free yourself from an expensive sentence. And it goes, why, when, what if? Or more specifically, why is this expensive sentence true? When is it true? And what if it's not true? And what we want to do when somebody says something that is not true or not helpful, or maybe just based on a false perception, it doesn't always work to go and say, hey, that's a silly thing to say, or you're being blockheaded, right? It's much more effective to come alongside them to try to validate and then work with them. So this follows a sort of conversational arc of engage the person and then examine the truth a little bit more and then enlighten. And that's what we're going to model in a couple of ways. The first question is just to say, hey, why is this true? Admit that at least some kernel of truth resides in that expensive sentence. And then secondly, to look more closely at the circumstances to see when it applies. And then finally, look at what it would mean if it didn't apply. So what we want to do is have a volunteer submit a specific expensive sentence that we can use. And I know you already put in some, but I don't want to spring this on anybody without asking. So if you'd like us to talk through your expensive sentence, just enter in right now, and Becky will pull one of those. And while she's doing that, I'm going to share a couple of examples from my own life. And one was at home with my daughter just last week, who came home and said, Dad, with tears in her eyes, the teacher thinks I'm a troublemaker. And I said, well, I wonder what this is all about. So I was thinking to myself, the teacher doesn't think she's a troublemaker. She's a good kid and she's a good student, and I know that's not the case. But I didn't want to just say to her, no, that's silly. The teacher doesn't think that. So I came alongside and I tried to apply this framework. I said, why, when, what if? Why is that true? Sweetheart, why does the teacher think you're a troublemaker? And she said, well, she had a stern talk with me and two of my friends today at recess. And then I wanted to go a little deeper. So I said, well, tell me, when did that happen? And what were the circumstances around which that happened? And she said, well, we were sort of doing this thing and distracting other kids, and I think she thought that because we weren't taking our work seriously. And so then we got at the specific circumstances that were associated with her thinking that the teacher had this perception of her. And then I said to her, well, I know that that might have been true at that moment with those circumstances, but I know also that you're a very good student and the teacher said a lot of nice things about you. So what if that's not really true? What if the teacher thinks you're a good person? She just had to say something at that moment. And then through her tears, my daughter sort of got a beaming smile on her face. And it's funny, this is a simple example, but a lot of us get in perceptions that somebody has a certain opinion of us. And that can be pretty damaging. It can be pretty limiting. So sometimes it takes a friend to sort of talk you through and free you from that, and that was very helpful for her. So I'll share another quick example, and then Becky, you can share maybe a volunteer if we have one. We'll go through quickly. I know we've just got a few minutes left, and we're going to honor this time commitment. But I was on a board, and we were scrunched for resources, as many nonprofits are, and we had an audit. And I was talking to a friend of mine saying, well, we have to do this audit. And I think when I said we have to do this audit, my friend heard an expensive sentence. And so he sort of tried to walk me down this the same path. And he said, well, why do you have to do the audit? And I said, well, all of our organizations like ours have to do this audit. And then he said, well, what's it for? When do you have to do it? What circumstances apply to that? And I started explaining that this audit led to a certification that helped us fundraise in a few different specific ways. But as we were talking that through, and he pressed me more, I was thinking, well, what are the specifics? I wonder how much money are we actually raising through these specific channels that require this certification? And then he sort of asked the question, well, what if you didn't have to do that? And I thought, well, now I understand a little bit better the cost and the impact of that. But if we didn't have to do that audit, it would save a lot of money, and it would save a lot of the CEO's time. So that would be a great thing. So that's another example of how thinking, well, the audit is something that we have to do was an expensive sentence for me, and my friend was able to sort of talk me through that. Becky, is there a sentence somebody shared that we can walk through with the group?
Well, there are several, and I'm going to recommend that maybe you use some of the others as inspiration for blog posts. But the first one that came in kind of stuck out to me. Mom and Dad use this person, this repair person. An expensive
Mom and Dad use this person. Okay, great. So look, you trust Mom and Dad. They've got a lot of experience, and the fact that they use this is an endorsement, right? So maybe that's a good person to use, and maybe that's a shortcut to getting to the right person. But then on the other hand, why do Mom and Dad use it? So let's say, well, why is this true? Okay, again, we trust Mom and Dad, so we use them since Mom and Dad use them. When is it true? Well, the truth that we should use them because Mom and Dad do would imply that Mom and Dad have sort of shopped it out. They know the right person, that they're using it for the same thing that we're using it for, but maybe that's not the case. So let's get a little deeper on the circumstances and say, well, maybe, what if there's somebody else that could do a better job or maybe do it for less, even though mom and dad use this person? Well, that would be great to get better results and to save some money. So I think that's a very good example, Becky.
I'm
Now I'm going
glad
to
you
jump.
like the one I chose.
So the third level of defanging an expensive sentence was just to get a little deeper into the details, and that's what we do in the book. And I'm not going to go through this now, but just going through more of the economics and the perceptions you have in your mind, and then how you can really measure that and make a better decision. And so with that, I'm going to do a quick review, and then Becky's going to share a couple things going on today and in the future. So real quickly, ask yourself, is that an expensive sentence? Does it bring on the feelings of stuck, special, or scarce? And if it does, you need to consider, well, how much might that cost you? Maybe it's money, but maybe it's time. Maybe it's an opportunity. Maybe it's simply joy or how you're feeling. Then when that is the case, how do you get out of those traps? We went through the very simple framework. Why, when, what if? Why is it true? When is it true? And what if it's not true? So when we're helping others break free from these, we want to engage with them, then examine the truth a little bit more closely, and then enlighten them. And I want to share with you that if you have the privilege to help somebody break free of an expensive sentence, it can be a great thing and can really help them see a brighter future and brighten their day and beyond. So with that, I'll thank you, and I'll let Becky take over.
Sure, Jack, and hopefully you're going to keep moving those slides for me. We do have a few special offers associated with your participation in today's webinar, but first we have a request. Today is the day that Jack's book is launching, and if you're willing to help share the book, you can go to the URL expensivesentences.com/launch, and you'll find some very quick and easy to share graphics and tweets, and we hope that as you do that, you'll promote the 99-cent Amazon Kindle deal, which is today and tomorrow only. And so if you know people who enjoy reading on digital, this is the perfect time for an inexpensive sentence, which is buy the Amazon Kindle version of this book for 99 cents, which is really less than the price of a Coke. So I hope they will all take advantage of that inexpensive offer.
And Becky, I know you have so many great promoters in your universe, and I really thank you. A lot of people have been great already in terms of getting the word out, so thank you so much, and this makes a huge difference in the book, so thank you very much.
Sure. So the next offer is associated with some additional content. So Jack has put together this awesome companion to the book called Wise Replies to Expensive Sentences. And if you buy a hardcover edition of Jack's book today or tomorrow and use a link that I'm going to put in my follow-up email to give us your address, Jack will send you out a free copy of Wise Replies to Expensive Sentences. Now, one thing I should let you know is that the the hardcover edition of the book is currently showing out of stock on Amazon, but that should be corrected very soon. So if you go ahead and take action and order the hardcover copy and let us know, we're going to send you this companion, which is tremendous and phenomenal, and I can't wait to get my hands on one. And one more thing, Jack has this amazing fun hashtag contest going on, and he's going to choose a total of 5 winners across the next week or so. If you send out an expensive sentence on Twitter using the hashtag expensive sentences, you're going to be entered to a random drawing to win this amazing pack, which includes the audio version of the book, a paperback of the Wise Replies, some decoder cards, and also another hardcover version of the book, which I expect you'll sign, right, Jack?
I will, autographed.
Indeed. So we hope you'll take advantage of those 3 offers, and we're going to stick around now for some questions, and we hope if you have some questions that you'll put those in the question panel. And while we're waiting for those to come in, Jack, I think I'll highlight a couple of the other expensive sentence examples, and maybe we can address some of those.
Sure.
So here's one that I saw that kind of stood out to me, Jack. It's an industry standard, so we should do it.
Which is a version of, hey, everybody else is doing it, right? So when you were growing up and you said, hey, Mom, everybody else is doing it, what would she say? She'd say, well, if everybody else was jumping off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? Now, maybe in your industry, people aren't jumping off bridges, but really the rationale of everybody else is doing it, you got to think of that pretty closely, because that means you're doing it based on precedence or based on peer pressure or some sort of expectation. Is that really leading to your goals and your results? There have been a lot of companies that have faded and been overtook by disruptors, especially in the last 30 years, because they kept on doing what everybody else was doing in their industry, and then somebody came along and did what nobody else was doing. So
Sure.
Think about Amazon, think about Netflix, think about lots and lots of examples.
Sure. So a question that someone had toward the end of your example about the board and the audit, someone was wondering if you actually had to end up doing the audit or what the conclusion of that was.
Yeah, that's a good question, and we are not doing the audit this year. We did it last year. We had this discussion again this year, and we're not doing it this year. And so yeah, it is a funny thing, and people have various experience with nonprofits, but this is an important certification in certain ways. But we sort of did the cost benefit and said, well, yeah, it's true. If we don't do this, we will be prohibited from certain specific ways of raising money, and we realized that those ways were not bringing in very much money for us. And so with our future, we decided not to do it this year, and it seems like the right decision.
Got it. What do you think about the phrase best in class as an expensive sentence?
Well, that's great because again, it's one of these things. It can be a marketing phrase, but it can also imply that that's something that delivers better value than other things around it. So the thing you need to decide whenever you're looking at the best in class or a premium product is first know two things. One, why are we paying for that premium? In other words, how's it being best in class good for me? How does it help me advance my goals? Because something may be best in class. There are cars that are much better cars than the one I drive, right? But for my purposes, I don't need to pay for an expensive car because my car suits my needs. Now, so understand what the premium is for and why you should pay it for your results. And then secondly, know what the premium is. So a lot of times you hear something kind of similar to best in class, and people say this to me often. Look, I wouldn't switch vendors for 10% savings. And I say, well, that's fine, but how do you know it's only 10%? And I think a lot of times we feel like we have a better sense of the market pricing than we really do unless we've gone out and gotten some recent specific data points in writing.
Sure, that's really helpful. So, Jack, what would you say to someone about how to overcome resistance? So, Shannon is mentioning or asking, what's the best way to get those who state or accept the expensive sentence to turn around and look at it in a new way? And so she's saying that in her experience, it causes friction when you want to challenge someone's thinking. So, any thoughts about that?
Well, that is a serious issue, and it's really that's the reason this book was written, actually, because this came out of an experience I had back when I was in procurement of a project that was my main project for about a year and a half. I didn't spend all my time on it, but I spent most of my time on it. And it led to a specific endpoint decision. And just to make it short, the company made the wrong decision. And I knew it was the wrong decision. And it wasn't a decision that I was promoting. But really, the reason we made that wrong decision was because of reluctance to change and resistance to change. So that's a huge deal at organizations where people are threatened and they don't want change, and all of that plays into it. Politics, turf protecting, and all of that. So I think you have to acknowledge that those forces exist, they're real, and they're strong. And there are some organizations in which only so much change is going to happen in a certain amount of time. And you just have to, make some bargains and understand that's the reality. Now, at more of a micro level, that's kind of why I like this idea of engage, examine, enlighten, or when is it true? I'm sorry, why is it true? When is it true? Then what if it's not true? Because the premise is that whatever this person's saying that's a limiting belief or an expensive sentence or a position that's kind of bullheaded or maybe just not seeing the whole picture, there's some truth, there's some validity. And if you look at it from a certain point of way, you can say, hey, yeah, there's some validity there, and I want to honor that. And I think if you start at that point, then you might have a little more entree to have the next conversation of, okay, look, I know that's true to a certain degree. How true is it right now and right here? Let's talk about the circumstances that really play here and what might have changed or what might be different from where, because I would agree with you on that a lot of the time. I guess what we're talking about is, does that really play here? Does that make sense? And then you might be able to say, okay, what are the factors? Assess it out, do a little bit more analysis, and base it on fact. But one of the things I say when I present to business groups is I give them ABC. ABC means attitudes, beliefs, and culture. And I like that succession because you can't change somebody's beliefs if they don't have the right attitude, right? A comes before B. So unless you're connected, unless you've got some rapport, unless you have the right attitude, don't even bother bringing down the whole stack of facts, right, and giving them the rationale, because the facts don't really matter until you have the right attitude, and then you can move forward.
So is there any easy way to find out or determine whether the person is open to those new beliefs? Like,
Is there any easy way that are people open? That's an interesting thing. If you look at a lot of our political discussion now, right? It's just, I think it's a great illustration of how so many people are not open because we're kind of screaming at each other. We're not really listening to each other, and we tend to say, well, the other point of view is totally wrong. It's not somewhat valid. So I think that's an example of how not to do it. And again, I think you have to just realize there's only so much you can change, right? I'm not much of a convincer myself. I don't try to convince people. But what I do try to do is look for common ground and then maybe reframe some perspectives or say, okay, let's look at this bigger picture. Let's look at this other part over here and then see, can we make progress together? Sometimes it's not possible, but a lot of times that approach will be more fruitful than the other approach.
sure, that makes sense. And I'm seeing a few questions come in that way. How do you change culture? How do you, yeah, so that's a really big job. So here's an interesting question that comes from our friend Nathan. And Nathan, welcome. I'm glad you're here. And actually, I'm glad you're all here. There's still 105 of you hanging out with us in this after hours Q&A, and that's pretty fun. I can tell the topic must mean a lot to you. So, Jack, how would you get people to commit to having a decision-making process? Because otherwise, the latest idea, as you mentioned, can throw the whole situation into a new direction anytime.
Well, this is one of the reasons that procurement are often the least favorite people at any company because they come in with a process. And what people have, what stakeholders have, like if I'm a vice president of marketing and I need to buy a new system to get our marketing campaign going, and then you come to me and you slow me down with the process, and I've been the bad guy on this, you're going to say, well, stop it. We got work to do here, and here you are coming in and telling me the process I have to take. So I think the first key is to connect to the problem that your stakeholder is trying to solve, right? And understand they're trying to solve a problem, right? So their problem always means more than your process. And I think you just got to acknowledge that, and you got to speak in a language which honors that they are trying to get results on something that's very important. Now, if you convince them of that, it's almost the old thing, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, right? If you've relayed that you understand their problem and that you care about their problem, then I think you have the grounds to come and say, okay, because I care about your problem a lot, I think this is the way to go look at it, right? This is the way to solve it. And I think we'd be selling ourselves short if we just jump to this conclusion because we might not really solve your problem. It might not solve it in the right way or for a long term, or it might cost too much. But look, if we invest a little bit of time on this process, I think what it's going to mean is we're going to solve your problem in a much better way that's going to save you a lot of time down the road. And would that work? So, I tell people in procurement not to lead with their process. Never lead with your process. Lead with their problem because that's what people care about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Nathan wants to clarify that for the record, he likes procurement people or anybody who can help
Thank you,
get
Nathan.
through the best practice or best process. Um, Man, there are so many questions here, Jack. I think that we could stay here all day, and I know that we committed to only about 20 extra minutes. Here's an expensive sentence to throw at you. We don't share the total cost estimates of the sorority house repairs because it will scare the members. So the expensive sentence here is not talking about money because you don't want to scare anyone. So what do you think about that one, Jack?
Well, I guess that the assumption behind that is that if people knew the whole truth, um, they wouldn't like it, right? And they'd react in a way that would be unfortunate. Um, and I think that's, look, there are judgment calls, and not every decision, not every process has to be fully transparent, right? And especially sometimes if you're leading an organization, there are times when you don't want to be totally candid with every detail because there are people and reputations at risk, and there are things that could fall out. But I think in general, I mean, if your position is, well, you're kind of hiding the truth because if truth gets out, it's going to hurt you, then that's tough to hold on to for long.
Got it. Well, here's another one Mary Ellen is throwing out. We don't share salary information at this company. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Now, is that an expensive sentence? I don't know because I think you could argue either side of that. Yeah, I've been in companies where they don't share salary information. That's what I'm more comfortable with. And then there are some that do share it. And I think the results, I saw a study on this recently, and I think the results were mixed. It wasn't necessarily a clear win that sharing the salary made things better or increased engagement or anything like that. So I'm not an expert on that. But again, yeah, I guess in general and for transparency, I'm not sure about salaries and compensation.
Sure. Here's one more to throw at you, Jack. What about the expensive sentence that we can't change technology because there's too much legacy data or knowledge of the particular platform that the company's been using?
Right. Well, that's a big one, and I've in several parts of my career, I've seen that. I've seen that in government agencies that I've been part of. I've seen that at big companies. I saw that in telecom, where we had all these legacy billing systems that were all kind of cobbled together, and so this is that question, and in one way, in another way, it's kind of a more general question that we all deal with, which is when is it time to change, right? When is it too late to change, and when is it right to change? The key thing that enters there is switching costs. What's the cost to switch, and then what's going to be our savings afterwards? And a funny thing about switching costs, and I write about this in the book, in my experience, people do one of two things. They either greatly overestimate switching costs or they greatly underestimate switching costs. It's kind of hard to get that right unless you really do go through a process and define it. So I guess I'd say, at some point you need to specify, well, what is the real cost to switch this? And let's not just say, oh, it's going to be a huge job. It's going to be $1 million. Let's actually break it down a little bit more. Let's put an hour into saying, what are the steps and ballparking the labor around that or the outside costs or whatever it's going to be. So if we just invest that hour, all of a sudden we're going to have a much better understanding of what the components are. And then in a similar way, we need to say, well, what's the benefit of switching? And I think often the parallel question there is, what's the cost of not switching? Because at some point, it's a cost that just slows us down and makes us a little bit less efficient, makes us a little bit less responsive. And then that's the cost until some other competitor comes in and they're not burdened by that old technology. And so their overhead is half of what yours is, and they're blowing you out of the water. And that happens, it's happened in all sorts of industries time and time again. So you need to understand the switching costs in detail with specificity, and then really look at what's the benefit of switching.
That's very helpful. Thanks, Jack. So my friend Paul, who I know is calling in from, I think, around Lansing, Michigan, and the two of you have communicated about the book, said that when he read the book, the sentences became so obvious, but he never thought of it. And he's curious how you did think of it. And I think you might have referenced the story, but maybe tell us a bit more.
Yeah, well, it was really funny. I mean, yeah, I talked about the story where they said, well, they haven't raised their prices in 8 years. And honestly, I mean, the first time I heard that, I thought, well, that's good, right? I mean that probably means we're doing fine there. I'm not exactly sure why I continue to pursue that instead of just letting it be, because I know in other cases I've heard sentences like that and just let them be. But then after we sort of hit that revelation and we tagged it an expensive sentence, I really started seeing it everywhere. And what I realized, and this kind of goes back to that process question, because I had the best processes. I mean, I was a really good analyst, and I had these beautiful spreadsheets and model everything out great, and I put together these PowerPoints that were dazzling, and I could really make my case as an analyst. But it occurred to me that, all this is kind of useless if I can't get people to get past these beliefs, because one senior level person with a belief that isn't true means more than all of my work and however smart my analysis is and however good my presentation is. So it's almost like I've got these tools and weapons and things that I'm going to use in my work, and then this big monster just kind of flicks his tail and it all goes scattering away. And that's how I see these expensive sentences. So I realized that if you don't get into some of these cultural beliefs, all the other work is meaningless.
That's really helpful. And Paul, hopefully that clarifies the story for you a little bit more. Well, Jack, I want to thank you so much. Oh, shoot. Here's one more question. Want to take one more and then we'll wrap it up?
Good.
Okay. So here's the question. What do you say to, once we get through this organizational change, we can look at it again? Oh my goodness, I'm so guilty of that one. Oh, as soon as X is done, we'll tackle this bigger problem. How do you answer that one?
Yeah, and this is big because we're swamped, right? We're swamped right now. I just can't look at this. And that's something I say a lot in my life. It's something every organization I've been part of, I think that enters. Now, sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not helpful to make one change while you're doing something else, and sometimes you don't have the bandwidth to really consider something. But there are a couple things to think about. One is this something that might actually get us less swamped? So we're too busy to get less busy sometimes. And there's an expression in business that it takes money to make money. So one of the things I write in the book is, yeah, that's true, but also it takes time to make time. And we often have to make investments so that we'll free up and become less busy. So is this thing that we're postponing thinking about, is that actually something that might help us sooner than we think? And again, I'd recommend just this little tactic of saying, okay, look, I don't want to think about it. I don't think we have time for it, but let me pause and let's just take half an hour. And let's get the team together and let's talk this through for 30 minutes and say, okay, what would this really mean? Because it seems like it's going to be a big deal to switch. It seems like it's not going to help us that much. It seems like we got too much else going on. But look, let's just get more concrete with that. Let's write down what the switch is, how much it would help us, and then let's think again, are we ready to make this change? Becky, it just occurred to me that that question is really the same as the prior question about the old technology, right? Because we're talking about changing old things to improve the new things. And so we just need to think about what's the benefit. And if we're really going to decide that we want to postpone this, let's just take a little more time and make that a thoughtful decision instead of a reaction because, oh, my day's so hectic, I got too much going on. No, you throw that at me. It sounds great, but I can't handle it. Unfortunately, that's often where we are. And I think to catch ourselves and to make a better decision can really help us.
Great, thanks so much. And again, thank you for all of you who have stayed for the after hours Q&A and for
Yes.
everyone who invested their time with us today. Jack, I appreciate you sharing your expertise with us, and I know I have a lot to think about as a result of today's call. Congratulations on your book launch, Jack.
Thanks so much, Becky. This has been great. Take care.
Bye-bye.